Charles C. Johnson is the author of Why Coolidge Matters, Leadership Lessons from America's Most Underrated President. A graduate of Claremont McKinney College, his writing has appeared in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, Reason, and the Claremont Review of Books. He has been the recipient of the Robert L. Bartley Fellowship and the Eric Bryndell Award at the Wall Street Journal, the Robert Novak Award at the Phillips Foundation, and the Publius Fellowship at the Claremont Institute. Please join me in welcoming Charles Johnson.
I want to thank you all for coming here today. It's quite an honor. Though I'm not an alum of Hillsdale College, I often find myself wishing I were with the company of people I meet here. I can take some satisfaction in that many of my professors were classmates or teachers of the teachers at Hillsdale College, but I truly wish I had known of Hillsdale when I actually applied to school now seems like many years ago. Calvin Coolidge, of course, was our last classically educated president, and I think he would have felt right at home at Hillsdale, a school founded on the truth that all are created equal, and which sent many of its best and brightest to fight and even to die so that Lincoln's hope that right might live. Hillsdale's motto, pursuing truth, defending liberty, is certainly something that Coolidge would have embraced. Fittingly, for those of us who understand that those who control the schoolhouse door ultimately control the White House, our subject is education, and what Calvin Coolidge, a neglected statesman, has to teach us about our contemporary politics and our own political order. As Tom Silver, the late president of the Claremont Institute, has shown, Calvin Coolidge wasn't so much silent as silenced by the New Deal historians who, unable to argue with the successes of his policies or the thought behind them, rewrote history to cast Coolidge as a villain or to caricaturize him. These New Deal historians had their work cut out for them, however. Coolidge, after all, proceeded over one of the largest expansions in economic growth in American history, and he had a lot to say. Coolidge gave over 500 press conferences during his presidency. He ran for office 19 times and won 18 times, working his way up from city councilman to president of the United States. Truly a small R Republican statesman. He was the last president to write his own speeches, and he penned 3 collections. He published a thoughtful autobiography after his presidency and wrote a very successful, internationally syndicated post-presidential column. My book, Why Coolidge Matters, is intended to faithfully report what Coolidge actually had to say and what he did say in the hope that we might restore his views about limited government, American independence, and constitutionalism. His thinking on immigration, civil rights, foreign policy, government unions, and especially liberal education warrant considerable attention by politicians today. This is, I believe, because Calvin Coolidge was a deeply religious man. He did not think a republic was possible without moral and religious education. And he believed that the Holy Writ's command, "You shall know the truth and it shall set you free," ought to be the guiding principle in all of our educational system as well as our republic. America, he argued, was founded by religious men. Its finest schools, he reasoned, succeeded because they sought to shape souls as well as opinions. And as we know, great presidents are products of their education. Coolidge knew well the value of education because his political thought had been shaped at Amherst, where, under the tutelage of its most famous professor, Charles Garman, a professor of philosophy, Coolidge learned everything he needed to know about politics. William James called Garman the greatest teacher in the United States, and Coolidge absolutely loved him. He dedicated 6 pages of his very slim autobiography to that old professor, and after he died, Coolidge's wife recounted that Garman's works sat on his nightstand table throughout his presidency, along with Paradise Lost and the Bible. Coolidge considered Garman, quote, one of the most remarkable men, end quote, with whom he had ever come into contact. He drew men out, Coolidge wrote, referring to himself. Garman's students saw in him qualities that they wished to develop in themselves: intellectual curiosity, tolerance, and idealism. Some students did develop those qualities in abundance, and Coolidge drew upon these men to form his government in times of crisis. Dwight Morrow, ambassador to Mexico, William Whiting, Secretary of Commerce, and Harlan F. Stone, Attorney General and later Supreme Court Justice. Never philosophically and perhaps physically far from his professors' lectures, Coolidge never forgot them or opposed their political teachings. Coolidge believed, as Garman did, that choosing the right thing would refresh the soul, sharpen the mind, and bring its just reward from providence in the here and now. Quote, "We looked upon Garman as a man who walked with God," Coolidge recalled. "His course was a demonstration of the existence of a personal God, of our power to know him, of the divine eminence, and of the complete dependence of all the universe on him as the creator and father in whom we live and move and have our being. Every reaction in the universe is a manifestation of his presence. Man was revealed as his son, and nature is the hem of his garment. While through a common fatherhood we are all embraced in a common brotherhood. The conclusions which followed from this position were logical and inescapable. It sets man off in a separate kingdom from all the other creatures in the universe and makes him a true son of God and partaker of the divine nature. This is the warrant for man's freedom and the demonstration of his equality. It does not assume all are equal in degree, but that all are equal in kind. On that precept rests a foundation for democracy that cannot be shaken." This is a theme that Coolidge would return to over and over again throughout his presidency and throughout his political career. Most important for our purposes, Garman taught his students the religious basis for Republican government, reasoning that as we have a common father in God the Father, we are brothers, and therefore only Republican government is possible. That men should live together in community as Christ did, as servants, not masters. That politics doesn't mean survival of the fittest, but sacrifice of the fittest. That it means men giving up their seats on the Titanic so that women and children might live, as Coolidge noted. And that the central teachings of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, need to be applied to the issues of his day, as well as, I would argue, to our own. Coolidge applied Garman's ideas and these ideas time and time again to issues of civil rights for blacks, women, and Native Americans, to immigration and how we might make immigrants American, to the impossibility of public sector unions in a republic where all are created equal, and even to foreign policy, where he rejected the Kaiser's pretension to rule the free men and women of Europe, and his first fights, of course, with the Bolshevists, who he refused to recognize as the rightful rulers of Russia. Indeed, even Coolidge's more controversial acts, which we can feel free to discuss in the question and answer period, the Immigration Act of 1924, the tariff, and his early progressivism have in their origins his thinking on the Declaration. To defend the Declaration, Coolidge knew that he would have to politically defeat the nihilists of his day, the Klan, the eugenicists, the communists, and the anarchists, whose campaign of bombing and agitation is eerily similar to that which took place earlier this week. Coolidge did this by understanding that man has a spiritual nature, that those who adhere to it will ultimately be triumphant, even in moments of despair. Quote, "Touch that spiritual nature and it will respond as the magnet responds to the pole." The most spiritual document in Coolidge's view was the Declaration. Coolidge, owing to his belief in divine intervention, used highly religious language when discussing it. In his eyes, the document was, quote, "a miracle, inspiring a reverence that helped bring pilgrims of every nation to America's shores. People at home and abroad alike," Coolidge said, "considered Independence Hall a hallowed ground and revered the Liberty Bell as a sacred relic. These symbols represent a spiritual event, and America had become, quote, a holy land." Now, I understand that Hillsdale students read Coolidge's speech on the 100th anniversary of the Declaration signing. But my favorite Coolidge speech on the Declaration is the one he delivered at the home of Daniel Webster on July 4th, 1916. It's important to consider that while some of Coolidge's language might sound a bit, for lack of a better phrase, neocon, he really would have agreed with John Quincy Adams' idea that while Americans are friends of liberty everywhere, they're custodians only of their own. Nevertheless, he thought that our principles could have their expression in other regimes, and indeed would. So with that, I'll read a short selection from that speech. The events of history may have added to the Declaration, but they have subtracted nothing. Wisdom and experience have strengthened the admiration of it. Time and criticism have not shaken it. But however worthy of our reverence and admiration, however preeminent, it was only one incident of a great forward movement of the human race, of which the American Revolution was itself only a larger incident. It was not so much a struggle of the colonies against the tyranny of bad government as against wrong principles of government and for self-government. It was man realizing himself. And Coolidge would go on. That realization persisted through time and touched all men's souls as it moved from Concord and Yorktown, marching on to Paris, to London, to Moscow, to Peking. Men of every clime respected the Declaration for, quote, it marked the entry of new forces and new ideals into human affairs. It represented the realization of the true glory and worth of man. And encouraged by that noble document, man would wrought vast changes that have marked all history since its day. Man's triumphal progress through time owed much to consideration of, quote, as Coolidge put it, natural rights. But as Coolidge reminds us, natural rights are not sufficient to live by. As Coolidge reminded the audience in Webster's Home, the preservation of these of natural rights requires an understanding of duty and pledging to one another and the body politic. Quote, the signers knew that well. More important still, the people whom they represented knew it. So they did not stop there. After asserting that man was to stand out in the universe with a new and supreme importance, that governments were instituted to ensure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they did not shrink from the logical conclusion of this doctrine. True Republican men understood politics as the sacrifice of the fittest, not the survival of the fittest. This homage to the Declaration runs deep in his writings. His first ever speech, his college prize essay, and his finest speeches all mention it. Coolidge continued to return to the Declaration because it was both a product of religion and education, which he called the twin supports of civilization. As he wrote to an Episcopalian Sunday school teacher in Washington, D.C. in 1927, quote, the foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country. Coolidge called for a religious revival in his day, and perhaps, I think he would argue, even in our own. Religious teachings, concerned as they are about how man should live, need to be universal for America's republic to endure. Now, we should remember that Coolidge was not sectarian in this view. I mean, some of his finest speeches are actually given to Jewish groups and to Catholic groups that would not necessarily have agreed with his more Protestant orientation. But he did think that religion was important as being a full and equal citizen. In Coolidge's view, we can deduce man's natural equality from both reason and revelation, and we can go about the project of instituting a government where men serve one another. On this point, Coolidge quoted the theologians of the founding, particularly John Weiss, who wrote that democracy is Christ's government in church and state. Weiss' works were reprinted in 1772, and according to Coolidge, had been, quote, declared nothing less than a textbook of liberty for our revolutionary fathers. The founders, in Coolidge's view, believed that ultimate sanction of law rests on the righteous authority of the Almighty. I argue that Coolidge's religious faith and his education are the bulwarks that actually prevented his mind from succumbing to progressivism's excesses. Education, he told a convention of the National Education of Scholars, National Education Association in 1924, is the cornerstone of self-government. While religion keeps America inoculated from dictatorship because Christ spent no time in the antechamber of Caesar. The separation of government and moral life to render under Caesar that which is his and God that which is his would keep America American. After all, religion had strong ties to America's civil life and history. It needed to be cultivated. Quote, our government rests upon religion, Coolidge told the Boy Scouts of America. Religion is the source from which we derive our reverence for truth and justice, for equality and liberty, and for the rights of mankind. And Coolidge, the one group that Coolidge did not believe could seriously be serious Republican citizens were atheists. And this was because atheists didn't recognize something higher than themselves. Even among the people who had hitherto been savages, religion's influence has always and everywhere been a force for illumination and advancement. Coolidge gives a very thoughtful speech on this point at Howard University, where he notes the progress of blacks effectively from slavery and from backwardness, as he puts it, in Africa to being full and equal citizens in the United States. And he says if it's possible to have this political progress in America, it's possible to have it as well in Africa and elsewhere throughout the world, which is something to consider. In Coolidge's view, religion breaks down all barriers of race or culture and replaces it with concern for the universal. New arrivals could be Americanized, he told an assembly of the foreign-born, if they keep up their devotion to religion. Immigration only becomes dangerous when people lose their faith. He feared that as the country grew less religious, our civilization might be lost and dependent on government. We cannot depend on government to, quote, do the work of religion because there is no way by which we can substitute the authority of law for the virtue of man. Trying to get government to save souls rather than to protect men's rights and trusted them to save themselves through their churches would ultimately lead to tyranny. This insight was why Coolidge ultimately broke with the progressives, who held that progress in modern science inevitably meant progress in political science and thus an overall quality of life. This argument of the progressives undergirded their belief that man was perfectible, a notion that Coolidge rejected out of hand at a commencement address at a Catholic college, Holy Cross, in Massachusetts. We have, quote, no right to expect as our portion something substantially different from human experience in the past. The constitution of the universe does not change. Human nature remains a constant. It follows from this assertion that the study of the classics, which speak to man's human nature and have existed throughout the ages, teach important lessons to mankind. For Coolidge, men come to the study of the classics because they, as he told the American Classical League, realize that the only road to freedom lies through a knowledge of truth, something I think Hillsdale could absolutely appreciate. This love of knowledge of truth is something that contemporary politicians, especially conservatives, ought to consider taking on for themselves. Coolidge is right when he says that every political party needs in some sense to be progressive rather than reactive. But how shall we define progress? Reading Coolidge might give people a good place to start. Coolidge's confidence in progress, according to the Declaration of Independence, paid political dividends. He got votes from blacks, from Jews, from immigrants, and from many others. He went anywhere to any audience and evangelized. He delivered the same Declaration-inspired message. Politicians, he noted, should avoid the politics of expediency and stick to the politics of principles. Perhaps contemporary politicians should do as Hillsdale students do and read Coolidge's speech on the Declaration of Independence, with which I'll close. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may, therefore, very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter, the Declaration. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of our revolutionary fathers. And with that, I'll take some questions. Thank you. Now, I understand that there's a lot of questions about Coolidge and that a lot of what people think they know about him may actually be wrong, so you can feel free to ask anything you want on Coolidge, and I'll try my best to answer it. Sir?
Stuart Reuter, how well supported was Coolidge by his own political party? I mean, he came in as a vice president under assassination conditions. Did he have full support?
Well, in fact, Warren G. Harding was not assassinated. He died. But I mean, to give you kind of a sense of it, Coolidge was very popular in Massachusetts. He was very popular among the party faithful. he was not necessarily popular among sort of the big wigs of the party convention. In fact, in 1920, when the Harding-Coolidge ticket forms, Coolidge was seen as something of a dark horse, that he was not popular by the people in the smoke-filled rooms, so to speak. But what ended up happening, of course, was his response to the police strike of 1919, in which he rejected this idea that police officers could have a loyalty to a union over their loyalty as public servants. And that response of calling in the National Guard, of actually restoring order, was very, very popular in the country as a whole. So that's what catapulted him to the vice presidency. Now he was, during his presidency, he was very popular among different groups. There were Coolidge Democrats back in Boston who crossed lines against what the Irish American Democrat leaders were telling them to do. And part of that was because Coolidge went door to door and actually spoke to the Irish as fellow citizens, which is something that the sort of clubby New England politics of the Henry Cabot Lodges and so forth, that they did not do a very good job of actually doing. And so Coolidge actually owes some of his successes, particularly early in his career, to going out and knocking on doors and doing the very sorts of retail politics. But to answer your question more generally, he was very popular among the party faithful, the sort of rank and file Republicans, but he was often distrusted by sort of the Senate leaders in the Republican Party. And particularly, it's interesting to note, and I try to go into this at some length in the book, the relationship with him and his successor, Herbert Hoover. I'm sure we'll get a question at some point about what if anything, what blame Coolidge should get for the Great Depression. And it's interesting that Coolidge criticized Herbert Hoover on sort of free market grounds. He said that for 6 years that man has given me unsolicited advice as Commerce Secretary, all of it bad. He referred to him dismissively as this wonder boy. And when he's writing his successful post-presidential column, he's criticizing the socialistic notions of government. This is during the Hoover administration. He doesn't even have to wait until the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I think it's interesting to note that Coolidge very much understood sort of small r Republican politics of going out and talking to people, because he had to. He started as a city councilman, worked his way all the way up. And there's not a taint of corruption associated with him. There's sort of none of the sort of thing we would expect of people who are machine politicians in our day. So I don't know if that helps. But.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question relates to his economic and budget-cutting policies.
Sure.
Coolidge was well known for using the veto to get rid of all pork barrel spending, and many could look at him as an example of where a Republican politician should go today. But many have said that the circumstances are entirely different now than they were in the 1920s. So would it be possible to have a president who is a ruthless budget cutter like Coolidge was today?
Yeah, here's where I sort of part company with my friend Amity Schlaes, who's written a good book on Coolidge as well. I believe that Coolidge's budget-cutting policies and his fiscal policies were the fruits of more serious thinking about government. So, for instance, I believe that he was in favor of limited government rather than more a libertarian small government. And I think it helps to a certain sense to imagine that in 1920, when the Harding-Coolidge ticket gets in, most of the cuts that took place were in things like defense spending. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily something we want to do today. That said, I do think that there is some truth to using the veto pen, to having real responsibility over government, to making sure that it doesn't grow too much. Because if government goes outside of its bounds, if it doesn't stay limited, it often does very poorly those additional roles it takes up for itself. And I think Coolidge understood, as he put it, that self-government means self-support. So some of the things that we have today, say like Social Security, Medicare, some of these programs that basically make people dependent on government, are things that he he opposed in his own day in his own way those sorts of programs. They weren't quite the same thing, but he was against things like aid to farmers. He was against giving giving even flood relief. He thought that local governments did it best. And I think that's something that conservative politicians ought to consider as well. I mean, during Coolidge's time, he knew local government very, very well. And we need to kind of consider what are the policies, what are the principles that we can turn into policies that will be effective at the local government level. Because there is no, the bounds of what is permissible in local government is a lot, I think, larger than the bounds of what is permissible at the federal level, and that's something that we should be mindful and considerate of.
I wondered if you could just clear up a point that was not clear to me in your presentation, and this is about the connection between religion, not religious freedom, on the one hand, and the Declaration of Independence on the other. So I thought what you were saying was that natural rights, which are in the Declaration, don't seem to be sufficient for Coolidge. And so Coolidge also appeals to religion. The question is the appeal to religion outside of or external to the Declaration, so that the Declaration is insufficient?
I don't think he would go that far. I think he speaks about, there are many speeches where I could kind of point to you afterwards, but where he discusses the Declaration as a spiritual document, as the product of both Enlightenment thinking and the Great Awakening thinking, that it's sort of working in tandem. It's not quite, how to put this, it's not quite, the Declaration of Independence is Coolidge sees it a spiritual document. Now, is it a sectarian document? That's a larger question. Does it get to actual natural rights? Can a non-Christian or a non-Judeo-Christian actually be a loyal and faithful citizen? I don't think Coolidge did not take up that issue. Can we be Republican citizens? He did not quite address that at that point. He does not see a division that perhaps we think of today between religion and the teachings of Revelation and the Declaration. He sees them as being joined at the hip. I don't know if that's helpful. If not, I can. Yeah.
Pass the microphone to the gentleman in the blue, please.
Yes, you spoke a little bit earlier about his views on education in terms of citizenship and the need to teach those that come and immigrate to the U.S. to become Americans. I wanted, in light of the bill that's in Congress now, if you could touch more on his philosophy of what type of immigration the U.S. should pursue.
Sure. I mean, one of the more controversial acts of his presidency is the Immigration Act of 1924, which set quotas on the numbers of immigrants that could come to the United States. Now, I actually defend this very unpopular bill in the book on the grounds that what Coolidge understood and what some of the politicians of his day understood is that there are certain types of people who can come to America and assimilate, and there are certain ones that cannot. He believed that perhaps some of the more Bolshevist-inspired ones of Eastern Europe could not become full citizens. And that kind of question, I think, is something that we as kind of conservatives need to think about. I mean, there are certain, put it another way, when Coolidge is speaking about Norwegian Americans coming and becoming full and equal citizens, that's a different sort of immigrant than, say, somebody who is from Chechnya, right? So that's something that we as conservatives need to address and need to think seriously about. Coolidge believed that immigration policy and foreign policy were linked, but he did not think about it in racial terms. While there were eugenicists that were around him, particularly his Secretary of Labor, Coolidge rejected that kind of eugenics thinking. He, in fact, says a number of very positive things about Japanese Americans, which I also go into in detail in the book. So he thought that certain nations could be made, or the nationals from certain nations could be made American, and that some could not. And that as he put it, that a lot of the policies around immigration, that in effect that some groups, how to put this better, that while some groups could assimilate, others could not. And I think that's something that we need to consider. So at the same time that he's doing that, though, the same time he's pushing those immigration bills, he's also making Native Americans, he's signing an act that makes all Native American citizens. And he's joining their tribes because he's trying to fuse the two populations into an American whole. And at the same time that that they're restricting immigration, he's also calling for federal, he's calling for a bill that limits, that basically outlaws lynching, because he argues that states' rights don't give you a right to do wrong. So it's a more complicated picture. I don't know what he would have thought of the current immigration debate today. I mean, I can tell you that I think we need to have more emphasis on how do we make people Americans rather than guest workers or voters. There's the language that we had in the 1986 amnesty bill. I don't think is currently talked about. We don't talk about how to assimilate people, how to make them part of America. And I think Coolidge, from the record, that he would have agreed with that.
We have a question from an online viewer. Eric in Minnesota would like to know, for Coolidge, was the Constitution a living document?
No. I think it's important. Harry Jaffa and the people at the Claremont Institute do a very good job of explaining that the Constitution is basically the form that gives life to the Declaration. Now, Coolidge did not think that the Declaration was the only document that you could that of importance. I mean, he would have listed, the Bible. He would have listed a number of things that we think of as being classically educated. He would have listed, a number of documents that we think of today as important documents in our political thought. But no, absolutely not. I mean, there's no way one could see the Constitution. I mean, he says to live under the United States Constitution is the greatest privilege ever afforded to the human race. I don't think that means you should tinker with it. This gentleman here.
Hi, thank you. What I'd just like if you could maybe comment about Coolidge's view of how politicians should conduct themselves and the character with which they should conduct themselves. And I just, as a preamble, give you a couple quotes that I pulled together for a little introduction to a book that we published of Coolidge's writings. And one was a quote by Cal Thomas, who said that, quote, "Politics in the end is not about drama, but about principle, not about charisma, but about character." And Richard Norton Smith said, "To most Americans, Coolidge was more than a character. He was character. To most voters, he was a leader of rare integrity and immovable principle." Just wondered if you could make some comments about that.
I mean, I think it's important to stress Coolidge's sort of tragic view of human nature when kind of thinking about this point. He comes from Plymouth Notch, Vermont, which even today is sort of a remote part of Vermont. He's from not quite poor, but not quite wealthy. I mean, sort of small R, everyone's sort of equal sort of citizen stock. And he did not think of himself as a great man. He referred to himself, he said that after his presidency, he very much wanted to return to life in Plymouth Notch. Or to Northampton, right after his presidency. He also understood that the words of the president have tremendous weight and they ought not be squandered. That if you go and run your mouth all the time as president, that will cause problems for you. And so he had a sense of his own limitations. And part of this, I think, is he understood that life is not always what we want it to be. I mean, when he was growing up, his mother died and his sister. And when he was president, his boy died while he was in the Oval Office. He got a blood blister and he died. I mean, there was sort of no notion of a right to health care, right? I mean, what we expect and demand of government today was not possible during Coolidge's day. And so I think it's important to kind of consider when we think about Coolidge as a man, that he had a sense of his own limitations and that maybe limited government needs people who understand that they're just, they put their pants on one leg at a time like the rest of us, that they don't behave like princes. And I think to kind of contrast him with President Obama, I think that's, the contrast is sort of night and day, that President Obama does think of himself as a great man. I mean, Coolidge very rarely took vacations, and when he did, he was working on those vacations. I think that's something that we need to kind of go back to. But I think if you don't teach people the virtues of tolerance and of frugality, that you will produce people who are narcissistic politicians who want to get everything they can out of a system. And I think that contemporary politics bears that out.
As I understand it, Calvin Coolidge is the first president after Lincoln, first Republican president or first president of either party that really emphasized the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal. And we haven't had very many Republican or Democratic presidents since his term, except for perhaps Ronald Reagan, who really had that emphasis. And my question is, what happened? We had 7 or 8 Republican presidents between Lincoln, who based so much of his policy on the proposition that all men are created equal. What happened and continues to have happened?
Well, I think part of this is an education problem. And as I try to argue, Coolidge was the last classically educated president. And I think it's important to understand that Coolidge would spend all of his time reading. I mean, there are mentions of him at Amherst reading the Federalist Papers and reading about Hamilton and about Lincoln. I think what Coolidge in many respects was Lincoln with a college degree, and I think it's important to kind of understand that as Coolidge saw it, and as I think as I see it, politics runs from the Declaration, the American founding, to Abraham Lincoln, to Coolidge's day, and then of course Coolidge was Reagan's favorite president. And I'm about to publish an essay soon on Reagan's involvement with Reagan's understanding of Coolidge, having gone to the Reagan Library. And that so if we want to go back to, conservatives are always wondering, how do we get back to Reagan? How do we go back to that glorious time? I think what we could do is we could actually go back and look at Coolidge, because Coolidge, we know, influenced Reagan's thinking. That as Reagan grew up as a boy, he listened to Coolidge on the radio. Coolidge was a very shy man who relied on radio to get his message out. And I think that's something we need to kind of consider as conservatives. Now, I don't know quite what happened between Abraham Lincoln's day and Coolidge's. I do know that Coolidge very much made a big deal politically of his ties to Lincoln. So, for instance, in the campaign of 1924, the people who were running the campaign for Coolidge were encouraged to go to every small town and get a list of all the Civil War veterans as an endorsement of the Coolidge campaign. So Coolidge very much thought of himself in line. I think part of it is Reconstruction. I think there was a desire by a number of people not to go back and refight old fights. I think a lot of it was just the poor education of the Republican presidents that followed between Lincoln and Coolidge. They were not many of them were not as, I would say, as classically educated as Coolidge. Is that?
Yes. Well, George Bush mentioned the Declaration of Independence many times, but I think the problem there is that it was a living Declaration of Independence. And so it was used in ways that didn't relate to the limited government notion that the Declaration, through the notion of government of consent, makes quite clear. And I'd relate that to a defense, very, very partial, of the phrase living constitution, because I think where it comes from is the notion of an ever-living God. I mean, it's sort of a secularization of that notion. And so that is a constancy, the notion of an eternity and ever-living God. Of course, what the people who use the term living constitution means is one that you could simply make things up as you go along. So I think what we need to do is, in our reverence for the Constitution, make it clear that it applies to all men, all Americans at all times, and that we need to be careful of the way we use the Declaration as well, in that it has eternal meaning.
I would agree with that. I mean, I would say that what's important in Coolidge's political thought is when he goes in as a young man, he's progressive, and he votes for things that would perhaps put him closer to Teddy Roosevelt than perhaps Taft or others. He votes for things like the direct election of senators. He votes for women's, or he's in favor of women's suffrage. And I think what's interesting about how he explains his defense of sort of progress is he always explains it in declaration terms, so that if you partake of actually fighting a war, as the Indians did in World War I, that therefore you have if you've partaken of the duties, that you therefore have the rights. And I think conservatives often think of the Declaration, or at least the sort of more neocon variety. They don't understand that the form of government matters tremendously. That while these principles are eternal, how one structures government is, that's where the devil's in the details. And I don't think that sort of President Bush understood. I don't think he understood that the American experiment in self-government was extremely complicated. I think he took too low a view of it and how easy it could be transplanted, or its principles could be transplanted. And I think that's something that Coolidge would have understood as well, because of his understanding of religion and of Greek and Latin education. But yeah, I mean, you raise a very important point about the living Constitution. I think one thing we as conservatives can do is try and understand progress and the amendments and so forth. Think in those terms. Think of progress in declaration, with the Declaration in mind.
Hi, and thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. As a Hillsdale College student, I've been privileged to be able to read some of the speeches you mentioned and learn a bit more about some things that I most certainly didn't know growing up. And I know we have some high school students here. So my question is, can you explain, or please, if you can, explain the tax cuts in as quickly as you can, but also perhaps a couple policy initiatives of his that most people don't understand or don't know about, and that might be relevant today?
Sure. Well, I think it's important that when you cut taxes, you also cut the size and scope of government. I think conservatives, by and large, have tried to pull a fast one and think that you can just cut taxes. Well, that may be true in the short run. I don't think it's true overwhelming. You can't cut taxes on the one hand and keep promising people things like prescription drug benefits. I don't think that works. I think it may be politically effective in the short run, but in the long run, I think it's, as Coolidge said, it's the politics of expediency. It gets you into trouble. I do think that, I mean, kind of to get at the larger question of the tax cuts, I think they were part of an overall toolkit that was developed by Coolidge with his Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon to stimulate the economy. But he did it not because for more kind of libertarian grounds. He did it because the government didn't need the money. So on the one hand, Coolidge is cutting. They were cutting defense during the early part of the 1920s, and Coolidge is trying to negotiate with the Japanese. His Secretary of State is trying to negotiate with the Japanese and with the British to actually reduce naval arms. But towards the tail end of his presidency in March 1929, he recognizes that we need to do something about what's going on in the country, or what's going on in the world. And so he signs the bill that creates the first aircraft carrier and creates a lot of the battleships. So a lot of it is you need to understand that at certain periods in time, certain decisions make a lot of sense, but at other times they don't. And we're always trying to take the policies and just reapply them. And I don't think that works. I think you need to think more about the principles to get how to think about the problems seriously and prudentially before you actually execute them. I don't know if that helps.
You set the stage earlier to say that someone would ask what the causal link was between Coolidge's fiscal policies and what happened in October 1929. Sure. Can you comment on what the major criticisms are?
Well, I think it's fair to say, I would recommend other books on this more than my own, but my understanding of it is that effectively, as Milton Friedman said, we had a Federal Reserve that wasn't up to the task, that effectively had created an inflationary economy, and that many of the problems that we associate with the 1920s were caused by the Fed. Now, I have sort of, my view on this is that while it's true that there was an inflationary economy, it's also true that there were a number of goods and services produced then that we still use all the time today. I mean, cars, radios. Coolidge is, of course, the first president to be on film. So it wasn't quite like the inflationary period of the 1990s, for instance, where everybody bought homes they couldn't afford. There were actual real things produced. And I think it's important to understand as well that Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, the sort of industrial titans of the day, all endorsed and liked Coolidge and met with him and associated themselves with it. So I think if I were to say what caused a lot of the Great Depression is I would say that Roosevelt prolonged it. That in effect, if you look at the recession of 1919 and 1920, that was actually a more severe recession that the Harding-Coolidge ticket dealt with by doing essentially nothing. And that I think a lot of people assumed in 1929 that it was the same sort of situation. And I think government policy, particularly policy of Herbert Hoover and of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, truly put the great in the Great Depression. So Coolidge, of course, even in 1932, there's a draft Coolidge campaign. People still thought he had things to say and to do and to teach. He, of course, dies in 1933. So I think it's important to understand him when he deals with Herbert Hoover. They're both Republicans, and Coolidge owes all of his political success to being a good Republican, Republican Party man. So he was not going to go out publicly and cause all of these problems. But nevertheless, in his post-presidential column, he does criticize the policies of the Hoover administration. He does criticize a number of other sort of big government Republican policies of the day. And I think that part of the story has not been told satisfactorily.
Who do you feel might be the Calvin Coolidge in the 1916 election?
2016. I was going to say. Yes, I met a gentleman 2 weeks ago who turned 101. And he remembers Calvin Coolidge, so it's quite something to talk with him. But as for 2016, Senator Ted Cruz did endorse my book, so I would be remiss. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. But I do think, there was a reason I asked him, right? Harvard educated, or Harvard credentialed, but more seriously educated. I don't think Harvard was quite the place it was in Coolidge's day, or perhaps John Adams's day for sure. But I think he's perhaps one. He's a very serious thinker. I would even say if Rand Paul were to get over his more libertarian inclinations, insofar as he doesn't do a good job of explaining why they're actually limited government impulses rather than libertarian impulses, I think that would be better. I don't know that he would necessarily be my first pick. But to a certain extent, we have a serious problem because we don't take seriously higher education. We don't take seriously shaping young people's, souls and minds. And I think we're in for some serious trouble in the country. I think that's being borne out now, and I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I think probably many of the reasons I like Hillsdale and my alma mater, Claremont McKenna College, is that to a very large extent it actually teaches these things seriously, the principles of the Declaration being classically educated. And if we continue to produce people who think only in terms of policy and of the politics of the moment, of the kind of the Twitter culture, that we're not going to be successful. We need to have people who think strategically about where the country is now and where it needs to be, rather than by day politics and year by year elections. Because I think those will follow if we have the policy, the principles seriously considered.
Didn't Coolidge ever criticize later in life the progressive amendments that really kind of enabled interventionist government, like direct election of senators or income tax or?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's important to understand, like, the income tax is one of, in terms of scope, it was not. I mean, it was much, much lower than it is today. Very few people paid it. That the people who did pay it, I mean, during Coolidge's presidency, this is something that actually I've enjoyed, kind of mocking some of my more left-wing friends about, that the tax rates actually got more progressive under Coolidge, even though he cut them. So, for instance, the rich paid more in taxes, partly because of a booming economy, but I think you raise an interesting point. I mean, Coolidge starts his career as sort of as a city councilman, but then a legislator, and he becomes president of the Massachusetts State Senate, and he realizes that, hey, we're just producing too many bills, that we have to give administration a chance to catch up. And of course, later on, when he becomes governor and ultimately president, he has that same sort of inclination, that he has a sort of shrink in his view of what government can possibly do. And I think as kind of conservatives, we should think about that, that the character of the office shapes the policies and how you think about the problem. Many of the issues that we're dealing with today that are a consequence of sort of the progressives' amendments were not fully understood or fully suffered at the time. Nevertheless, I do talk about this in the book about the foreign policy. I do think that the foreign policy considerations with the direct election of senators, that what happened was you got foreign policy that was a lot less sober, that effectively what was happening is people were campaigning in their own districts or in their own states with the immigrant groups and trying to create policies that would favor them rather than that would previously favor the states. So you've got to remember at a certain point in the 1920s, you have people who are directly elected, and you also have people who are brought there to represent their states. And so it created kind of an interesting dynamic, particularly in foreign policy, that I think Coolidge appreciated. But he never, to my knowledge, spoke out against the income tax amendment. He, of course, thought taxes should be low, but that was to have limited government, not because there was some sort of principled objection to the income tax. Oh, yes. So prohibition is actually really interesting. I regret that I did not go into prohibition in the detail it deserves in the book, because prohibition. So Coolidge believed that all of the lower the states like in Massachusetts and others that wanted to effectively ignore prohibition or create their own kind of local laws, he thought that what they were doing is they were doing a disservice to the law, writ large. And so while we know that many of the members of his administration drank, Andrew Mellon among them. He was not one to do that. Maybe it's because some people think that Warren G. Harding died because he liked to drink. But I think it's interesting that the way he deals with the problem of prohibition is he saw it as sort of an overreach, but yet his job as president and as a political figure was to enforce the law. So I think were it up to Coolidge. I mean, he was campaigning in Irish American areas. People knew him in his early political career as more a wet than a dry. But he was not. I think he would have agreed with, say, Lincoln's speech on the Temperance Society. I think he would have been more inclined with that kind of thinking about the issue of prohibition, if that helps.
And we have time for one more question.
Go to Ken again.
2 years after Coolidge died, there was this huge Tocqueville revival on the 100th anniversary of his book. And I'm wondering whether Coolidge ever mentions Tocqueville, given their interest in religion.
Well, we know from Amherst College, he doesn't mention it in his autobiography, even though he mentions all the other books he's read. But we do know that he read Tocqueville. We don't know, I couldn't find any mention of it when I was looking for it myself, because I wanted to sort of compare Coolidge's upbringing in Plymouth Notch to kind of Tocqueville's description of small r Republican life. But there's not a lot of it. I mean, I would say he was Tocquevillian, but not necessarily inclined to quote Tocqueville. We do know that actually he was very admired by French thinkers who did quote Tocqueville in Coolidge's context, which is interesting. There's a guy, André Siegfried, who wrote a book sort of doing an update of sort of, he considered himself sort of writing the appendix for Democracy in America, and he wrote it in the 1920s, and he compares Coolidge all throughout with Washington and with other figures. It's well worth reading. You can get it for like 10 cents on Amazon, so it's well worth checking out, even for just an afternoon. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.